He also quoted a Quranic verse, La ikraha fid din, which means there is no compulsion in religion. Compulsion is worthless. At the point of the gun or the knife, you force somebody to say, read the Shahada, the Kalima, the Creed of Islam, and the man is forced to read. What is it worth? Nothing. There is no compulsion in religion. But the insinuation is that the Muslims were doing compulsion. I said, look, my brother, Sharosh, you are a proof that the Muslims didn't use any compulsion for 1,400 years. For 1,400 years, you and your other Christians, whom you now say number 14 million, they lived in our midst. In Egypt, the Muslims have been the overlord of that country for 1,400 years. For a few years, the French came, for a few years, the British came, but overall for 1,400 years, the Muslim has been ruling that land. And yet, today, you can boast there are 10 million Coptic Christians in Egypt. If there was compulsion of any kind, there would not have been a single Christian left in the country. The Muslims ruled Spain for 800 years. 800 years. Because we failed to deliver the message, we were kicked out. We were kicked out. Shame on us. We didn't fulfill our obligations. But if they had used any type of force, even economic force, for 800 years, there would not have been a single Christian left in that country. We Muslims, we ruled India for 1,000 years. But after 1,000 years of Muslim rule, eventually when partition takes place, the Muslim gets 1/4, the Hindu gets 3/4. Why? Because we didn't do the job. We didn't use any compulsion. And which Muslim army went to Indonesia? Which Muslim army went to Nigeria? Which Muslim army conquered the east coast of Africa? Which Muslim army? Today, the Britisher and the American, he is coming towards Islam. I want to know what sword? What sword? What sword is the Muslim using? The sword of the intellect. George Bernard Shaw, he said, if any religion has a chance of conquering England, nay Europe, within the next 100 years, so that religion is Islam. Look, Bernard Shaw had the foresight, he could see. But we Muslims, we have failed Islam. Wallah, we have failed. We have failed. We haven't made a start yet. We believe. We say we believe, but we have not made a start yet. This is our problem. The destiny is ours. Wallah, it is ours. Allah says, لِيُزْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. He has given you a deen, a way of life that is the master, overcome and supersede them all, bulldoze them all, whether it be Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianism, Communism, Judaism, everyism. Sword. I'm asking, what sword? Thomas Carlyle in 1840, he delivered a series of lectures here in the UK. In England, Thomas Carlyle, one of the greatest thinkers of the past century. Thomas Carlyle. And he says, the sword. He said, the sword indeed. But where will you get your sword? He said, every new opinion at its beginning is precisely in the minority of one. In one man's head alone, there it dwells as yet. That he take a sword and try to propagate with that will do little for him. He said, first you must get your sword. And how do you get your sword? Through the intellect, through reasoning, Udu ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati. Allah says, invite all to the ways of thy Lord with wisdom, the sword of the intellect of wisdom. Wal maw'izatil hasanati, and with beautiful preaching. Wajadilhum billati ahsan, and reason with them in the ways that are best and most gracious. This is the sword.
What would you do to someone who murdered members of your family, tortured your friends, and made your life extremely unbearable? When the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, conquered Mecca, he had the non-believers assembled before him. They were the very ones who for nearly 2 decades mocked, abused, tortured, and murdered his family members and friends. Do you know what he, peace and blessings be upon him, did to them now that they were completely helpless and at his disposal? He forgave them and freed them. Yes, you heard right. He forgave them and freed them. The very ones who had murdered and mutilated the body of his uncle. The very ones who were responsible for the murder of his daughter. The very ones who had tortured and mocked him and his friends and family. Freed and forgiven. If you find such incredible mercy hard to believe in, please go and educate yourself about the day known as the conquest of Makkah. This was the very nature of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, a forgiving and merciful nature. And this example, the day of the conquest of Makkah, is only one of many, many similar examples from his blessed life. Today, it is very unfortunate that there are people who try to paint a twisted picture of the Prophet of Mercy, peace and blessings be upon him, due to their hatred born out of being brainwashed by an extremely manipulative media and biased books written by people full of hatred for Islam and Muslims. The fact of the matter is, there is no one in history more merciful than the Prophet of Mercy, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. The following video will show you just 15 of the many selections from non-Muslims telling you what they think of the last prophet, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Dr. William Draper, in History of Intellectual Development of Europe, 4 years after the death of Justinian, AD 569, was born in Mecca in Arabia, the man who, of all men, has exercised the greatest influence upon the human race, to be the religious head of many empires, to guide the daily life of 1/3 of the human race, may perhaps justify the title of a messenger of God. Philip K. Hitti, in History of the Arabs, within a brief span of mortal life, Muhammad called forth of unpromising material a nation never wielded before. In a country that was hitherto but a geographical expression, he established a religion which in vast areas suppressed Christianity and Judaism, and laid the basis of an empire that was soon to embrace within its far-flung boundaries the fairest provinces in the then civilized world. Thomas Carlyle, in Heroes and Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, the lies which well-meaning zeal has heaped round this man are disgraceful to ourselves only. A silent, great soul, one of that who cannot but be earnest. He was to kindle the world. The world's maker had ordered so. Mahatma Gandhi, statement published in Young India, 1924. I wanted to know the best of the life of one who holds today an undisputed sway over the hearts of millions of mankind. I became more than ever convinced that it was not the sword that won a place for Islam in those days in the scheme of life. It was the rigid simplicity, the utter self-effacement of the Prophet, the scrupulous regard for pledges, his intense devotion to his friends and followers, his intrepidity, his fearlessness, his absolute trust in God and in his own mission. These, and not the sword, carried everything before them and surmounted every obstacle. When I closed the second volume of the Prophet's biography, I was sorry there was not more for me to read of that great life. Edward Gibbon and Simon Oakley, in History of the Saracen Empire, London, 1870. The greatest success of Muhammad's life was effected by sheer moral force. It is not the propagation, but the permanency of his religion that deserves our wonder. The same pure and perfect impression which he engraved at Mecca and Medina is preserved after the revolutions of 12 centuries by the Indians, the African and the Turkish proselytes of the Quran. The Mohammedans have uniformly withstood the temptation of reducing the object of their faith and devotion to a level with the senses and imagination of man. I believe in one God, and Muhammad, the Apostle of God, is the simple and invariable profession of Islam. The intellectual image of the deity has never been degraded by any